Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Hello, and welcome back to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith. I will be your host today and most weeks. I apologize for being a couple days late. I was pretty sick, which means, unfortunately, I did not get a chance to see the new Star Wars movie, which is a bummer. I'll try again next week. I've heard good things, which is good, considering the last one was not received as well, to say the least. So I will, in the interest of hopefully not beating dead Bantha to death, right? Yeah, that'd be the way to rephrase that in a Star Wars way. Yeah, dead Bantha. I thought it was pretty funny. We are going to be talking about something different today than Star Wars specifically, though I apologize, it's really hard to get away from the gravitational pull of Star Wars, so I will be mentioning it today. But we're going to be talking about something that's pretty ubiquitous in the world of storytelling and especially in the world of science fiction. So I'm just going to get right into it. When we are sitting down to engage with a story in the form of like a book or a movie, TV show, etc., we are pretty often faced with this subconscious feeling that this thing in the story means more than what it means at face value. It's kind of like that feeling that you get when you're reading a book and something in it really strikes a chord with you, or you're like suddenly able to visualize or empathize with the character on a new level. An instance of this for me in particular was when I was reading a book called The Sound and Fury by Faulkner, if I'm remembering the author correctly. There's this particular scene where they're fishing, and it kind of has this extra meaning that's implied through the way that the characters are interacting, and it's this interaction that's been built up throughout the entire storyline. It just kind of comes to this turning point in the story that's just really good. So that feeling is kind of like a subconscious connection that you have to this idea of symbolism or symbolic language. So symbolism is a word that I'm sure that you've heard thrown around quite frequently, especially if you were in high school at any point in the last probably like 50 years. Symbolism is the idea that phrases, images, experience, etc. ultimately have more profundity than what is on their surface. A perfect example of this is, of course, the ring in Lord of the Rings. It's obvious that the ring represents more than just the end of existence, which in itself is a form of symbolism. The ring representing that idea of nothingness or the end of things as we know them is its own form of symbolism. So symbolism is actually pretty hard to avoid when you're doing anything in storytelling. It's kind of all-pervasive. And that is, well, I'll get to that in a second, right? So that's because of a very specific reason. So we're kind of hovering over this ethereal idea, and we haven't even gotten to like science fiction specifically. I apologize. We're going to get there. I think that we're going to have to have a meaningful discussion about symbolism. I think we kind of first need to have like a super brief discussion about language itself, which sounds like a pretty tall order. But I'm going to take a crack at it just to give it a try. So language is roughly summarized as a series of concepts, symbols, and signifiers that are encapsulated via commonly recognized sounds, symbols, etc. So words and letters, right? And you can do this with motions as well, like with sign language, right? So why is this important? And also, that is absolutely not something that merits brief discussion. I know that I'm sure that I'll get plenty of flack for that definition. It's important because symbolism is a ubiquitous tool in storytelling that relies on that concept, right? So if the idea of language itself is based in symbolism in some way, because each word symbolizes something to you mentally, then when you're telling a story using language, it's impossible to avoid symbolism. And this is part of why we love stories in the first place, because we're able to kind of like either put ourselves into the story or into the shoes of the main character through some sort of like symbolic relation that we have with the things that they're going through or different aspects of their journey, or because we're kind of able to relate to the things that they're seeing because we're taking their experience and it symbolically means something to us as individuals. And this is something that's not even necessarily conscious, right? It's part of why there are things like the hero's journey that we talked about last week, where there's this kind of like universal narrative that we all find super accessible and relatable, because it plays on these subconscious desires or conscious desires that we have as individuals that we're, somehow inherently attracted to. And part of what makes this discussion kind of, I would guess you could say, more difficult to have is that you're kind of always playing with this line of like, well, how intentional was that, right? So like, did that author really intend for that thing to mean this thing? And the answer is, I would say frequently no. The author really does not intentionally impart any extra symbolic meaning into an aspect of their story. But by not doing it intentionally, they're kind of leaving an open canvas for us as a consumer of that particular thing to really appreciate and understand it more, right? So, but why is all of this pertinent to science fiction? Well, because I think that science fiction is the perfect place for symbolism. Science fiction at its core is a setting-reliant medium that relies on our ability to buy into / visualize the setting, right? So when you're reading a book, let's say, for instance, The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. It's kind of a classic collection of short stories. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. If you haven't read The Illustrated Man, also a collection of short stories by Ray Bradbury, also highly recommend it. I think they're two excellent collections. But part of the reason that those stories become impactful is because you're able to buy into the settings. There's one specifically that I'm thinking of where Ray Bradbury is writing about a virtual reality room that two children get to play in, and their parents are kind of getting upset with how often they play in that room. Probably sounds familiar to like your kids and a cell phone, right? I don't have kids, but if you have kids, I've seen kids argue with their parents over cell phone usage, right? So he's made a setting that maybe back when he wrote the book, which I don't know when it was off the top of my head, I apologize, was not super plausible, but now very plausible, right? So he's got us bought into the setting. Well, now he can impart all sorts of other meaning into the rest of his story, right? Star Wars is very similar, right? Here is this setting that we have placed the hero in to have his journey. Now please buy into this setting so that we can continue on this journey. And here is this blank canvas for you to paint all this meaning on to relate to the character in specific ways on. So that's part of why science fiction is so great at that. And what makes this such a perfect place for symbolism to thrive is because everything becomes symbolically related to a loose form of truth or knowledge that we currently have, right? That's what makes part of what makes science fiction is that it is based on an expansion of something that we currently know or an interaction with something that is unknown in a setting that is relatable to us, right? And because of this core thing that science fiction is, right, the exploration of something that we are familiar with being juxtaposed by something that we have minimal to no comprehension of, we as consumers are charged with creating meaning, creating visualizations, etc. of that thing or those people or those places. And those kind of have to be anchored in something familiar in order for us to truly kind of like understand or be able to place ourselves into that particular story. Great example of this. Can you think of a science fiction piece that isn't at least centered around humans or some humanoid life form? And by humanoid, I mean like a Wookiee is humanoid. It stands on two legs. It has to breathe. It clearly eats, right? I personally can't think of one because to most of us, the idea that sentient life could exist in non-humanoid form is beyond our regular scope of thought. We assume that things that live would need to eat or need to defecate or would reproduce in some form that our current science could categorize. And the reason that those things are pertinent to this discussion is that symbolism ultimately is grounded in our ability as readers to interpret and interpolate information that is given to us through the writing or the visuals of science fiction. And the more relatable or fantastic or in some cases possible those things are, then the more like horrifying or exciting or etc. those things can be to us as consumers. And ultimately, that's part of why science fiction is such an effective method of storytelling, because it has such a broad canvas for you to paint those things on and for us as consumers to put meaning into those things. So we're going to get into some specific symbols from some of familiar and one probably not as familiar to everybody science fiction franchises, but that will be right after this commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back, everybody. So right before we went to break, we just finished kind of talking about the importance of symbolism in storytelling in general, but specifically in science fiction. So we're going to get into some specific symbolism that I think kind of will add some extra meaning to the films that you know and love. And we're going to start, since we started with Star Wars last week, we are going to beat a bantha with a stick. We're going to start with Star Wars. And we're going to start with something from the prequels. We're actually going to start with two things from the prequels, but we'll go one at a time. So, first off, I am going to talk about Anakin's Immaculate Conception. We're going to start with Episode 1, since Episode 1 is technically the first, even though it came out several years after. I was just explaining to somebody the other day the confusing timeline of Star Wars movies. And if you are not somebody who is into science fiction or who is nerdy, then trying to explain to someone that the prequels came out, like 15 to 20 years after the last movie in the original trilogy came out is nearly impossible. It just doesn't make sense to most people. And quite frankly, I would agree. But hey, I'm not here to judge George Lucas. So, Anakin's Immaculate Conception. Now, of course, when you think Immaculate Conception, you think Christian or Bible narrative. And part of putting meaning into something that's symbolic is following that like chain of thought that you get from your initial reaction. So you hear Immaculate Conception, you first think, well, religion. So if you go to look at religion for a definition of Immaculate Conception and its importance, one of the main ideas that makes Immaculate Conception important is that Jesus, as a baby, was formed free of the sin of Adam and Eve. So even in the womb, he is set apart, which, when you look at that symbolically, and the idea that Anakin Skywalker is supposed to be the chosen one, then you see a pretty heavy parallel there. Now, this, of course, is just a very basic interpretation of that particular thing. So let's look elsewhere to see what else Immaculate Conception could possibly symbolize. Pretty much anywhere you look in literature, or just in general mythology or storytelling, what you'll find is that Immaculate Conception usually implies some sort of special destiny or greater purpose. And it has been brought into question whether or not Anakin's conception was immaculate in recent Star Wars canon. But even if you look at alternative forms of conception, so Zeus birthing Athena from out of his skull after he had consumed the pregnant Matisse, you get the result of this alternative conception, which is a goddess. And in almost every instance in mythology, that's what you're going to get, is if there is alternative conception, this child is ultimately destined for something much greater than what would normally be considered humanly possible, which lines up perfectly with, and I know this is a lot of hate, the idea of midichlorians, the idea of the chosen one, the idea of bringing balance to the Force being placed on the shoulders of Anakin at that time. Now, continuing on, but sticking with Anakin, we're going to move to episode 3 for the lightsaber duel on Mustafar. And this is where I wanted to kind of highlight the importance of setting and how the setting of something in the story can serve as a symbol itself. So Mustafar is a moon that is completely volcanic due to dark side activity that occurred on it years in the past. And if I remember correctly, the story is rather similar to Anakin's, where it was two kind of star-crossed lovers who were hoping to save their romance via some sort of special means, and ultimately ended up bringing ruin to everybody, which, surprisingly enough, repeated in the main storyline. So because the moon is volcanic, I think that it is representative of what's going on inside of Anakin at the time. And this may seem fairly obvious, but I think that it's important to point out the things in story that we think are obvious that nobody else is taking notice of, because part of what makes those things obvious is that it is representative of something ultimately universal. And that universality is what makes good stories good. Well, frequently that's what makes good stories good, is our ability to relate to them, our ability to find meaning in them, etc. So we've got it on this volcanic planet that has had a previously similar story occur on it, and we have these erupting volcanoes and this chaotic force that's interfering with this explosive lightsaber duel. And I feel that the setting is symbolic of the emotion that Anakin is going through, because ultimately it is chaotic, and it's surprised him as a character and surprised us as viewers throughout the story. When we first meet Anakin in episode 1 and 2, if we know our Star Wars lore, we know that eventually he turns into Darth Vader. And part of why we're invested in these prequels is because we really want to know, how does this terrible child actor who can not speak whatever language it is that Sebulba is speaking very well turn into the kind of dark Sith that's going to rule the galaxy with an android fist? And we get a lot of that transformation in episode 3. Actually, we get most of that transformation in episode 3. We really get kind of the catalyst in episode 2 when we see Anakin falling in love with Padme, but that's not what we're here to talk about. In episode 3, we see all of the chaos of Anakin's confusion coming out in all the things that are happening to him and all the things that he's doing. Like, he would never have thought, and no one else would ever have thought, that he would murder young Jedi in cold blood. He didn't even think that he would decapitate Count Dooku, the man who chopped off his hand. So in all of this chaos that's occurred before, we see again being mirrored in the duel on Mustafar. And then lastly, the last thing that we'll talk about from Star Wars is the cave that Luke goes into in episode 5 on Dagobah. It's probably one of the most memorable scenes from the original trilogy, in my opinion, because it speaks to this subconscious thread that we as viewers have that connects us to an idea that has been used in literature for a long, long time. The idea of the cave in the hero's journey is a key part of the hero's journey. Symbolically, a cave is like an underground place that's full of dark secrets, and it's unknown, and it's terrifying. You can never tell how far down it goes. You don't know what's in it. You can't see. It represents this alternative form of living in a way, because there are things that live in caves that don't have eyes and things like that. And now that might be getting a little bit too specific, so let's just get very basic on a philosophic idea. I'm sure that we've heard of the idea of Plato's cave, where what we believe is truth is actually a shadow of what is true being portrayed on a wall that is before us. So the cave in the case of episode 5 represents enlightenment for Luke. It represents an opportunity for him to enter into a new space and enter into a place of gaining new knowledge. And it's not just about knowledge of the world around him. Ultimately, what the cave represents is a reflection on what's within. Before Luke goes to enter into the cave, he asks Yoda what's in there. And Yoda says, only what you take with you. Which is why it's so interesting that what we see after Luke goes into the cave and has his encounter with Vader is himself, ultimately. So symbolically, I believe that the cave represents, in this movie, an examination of the darkness that lies within us as individuals. It's an acknowledgement that ultimately part of what makes us human is our fallibility and our lack of ability to be completely good or be completely evil. And in the story, this information is really important for when Luke finds out that Darth Vader is indeed his father and gets his hand chopped off. Because what happens is that Luke realizes that he is just as fallible as he was in the cave at all times, and that this new knowledge isn't something to be taken lightly. And I think it's partially because of this that he believes that Darth Vader, who is his father, is someone who can be saved or redeemed ultimately. And part of the reason that this scene stands out so much to us as viewers is that it's very relatable to be fearful of looking within. And it's very relatable to be fearful of acknowledging the depths of disparity that almost any person can achieve in their actions, which is why it's so symbolically powerful. So we're going to move on to another franchise and talk about some symbolism, in that franchise, but that will be right after this commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. So, right before the break, we just finished talking about some important symbolism that is used as a storytelling mechanic in the Star Wars trilogies. We're going to move on to a franchise that we haven't talked about here yet that I love, even though I haven't seen any of the original movies in their entirety. I have, however, seen this film, and that film being Prometheus, which a lot of people did not like, which I am really surprised by. I thoroughly enjoyed that film. I felt that the cinematography was excellent. The pacing was, I'd say almost impeccable, honestly. And the content and the use of symbolism was really, really good. I think that the reason that a lot of people probably didn't enjoy this one as much was because it was a little bit more of a slow burn with the horror, and it didn't have quite as many jump scares as the original stuff did. But that's neither here nor there. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. If you don't like it, maybe I can help you like it a little bit more. So to start, as far as symbolism is concerned, I apologize for the stutter there. We're just going to get started with the name in itself is symbolic of something. Now, I'm sure that everybody has heard the name Prometheus and that they have some sort of familiarity with it. So the Greek meaning of Prometheus is possibly forethought, as in like before thought. That's obvious. And in mythology, in Greek mythology, Prometheus is the one who creates the human race from clay and then angers the gods by giving that race fire. And in angering the gods, he is imprisoned or sentenced to an eternity of being tortured, though his sentence is cut short by Hercules, I believe, where he is tied to a rock, and buzzards come and eat his liver every day, and because he's a titan and is immortal, he regenerates every day and has to go through that same pain over and over again. If you're familiar with other Greek stories, this seems like a pretty common theme. If you know the myth of Sisyphus, then you would know that most things in Greek history, if they involve punishment and it's not death, it's usually, here, suffer this thing every day. Yeah, sounds kind of like real life. They do a good job. So I think that the meaning of Prometheus, the symbolism in the name, comes more from the latter portion of the Prometheus mythos than it does from the first, because arguably the fire that is brought in this particular aspect is the alien that comes to terrorize humanity later on. So I don't necessarily think that it's beneficial. And if you know anything about the Alien franchise, the idea of having something come out of your insides against your will is pretty common, but we'll talk more about that later, don't worry. But back to the subject at hand. one of the main points of the expedition that they're on is to find some sort of way to achieve immortality for the owner of the company that funds this expedition, which in a way is playing with something that goes beyond the limitations of humanity, which is part of what Prometheus does in giving man fire. Now, the catch is that Prometheus eternally suffers. I guess mankind does as well, though I don't know if that is at the behest of Prometheus necessarily. But if we are looking at applying the name symbolically to the thing that it is that they're, or the people of and the crew of the ship, then it's incredibly applicable, because what they find is some form of biological weapon that can alter the genetic structure or the biological structure of that which it comes into contact with, which is a pretty common theme in a lot of science fiction films, if we're being honest. And ultimately, the discovery of this thing that could grant some form of immortality or some form of enhanced life does end up punishing humankind for a long period of time. And this idea of what is achievable by humans, what makes something human, what is beyond human, is something that Ridley Scott plays with a lot in a lot of his films. AI is a pretty common trope in everything that he does. If you've seen the original Blade Runner, it's one of the main tropes in that particular film. And ultimately, this pursuit of that which is beyond human is what yields the suffering or the consequences of the individuals in the film. So we're, pretty in line with what the story is trying to tell us and looking at symbols that kind of enhance that meaning. Now, we're going to talk about something else that's also in that franchise. The idea of face huggers and the concept of an ovipositor. So a face hugger uses an ovipositor to deposit an egg, an ovi, into the stomach or chest cavity. I don't know specifically biologically where it goes, into a victim where the larva or the egg will develop into the xenomorph, which will eventually burst out of the chest of an individual as a semi-fully formed creature, which is a perfect hunting machine, which is developed by the black ooze on the planet that the Prometheus ship was on originally. Now, the statement that I'm going to make next is kind of like a chicken or egg statement, but I think that it's something worth noting. The idea of something being able to latch onto your face and then deposit something in you which will inevitably kill you is heavy in symbolism. Not to mention the Freudian symbolism that's present in that interaction, but just on like a reflective level, something similar to the cave. So when we think of that thing happening to us, it inspires a lot of fear. Because the idea is that something is against our will, depositing the seeds of our own destruction within us. But I would like to posit that perhaps not only is it literally doing that, but it is a metaphoric representation of that idea in itself. So much like the cave, that which would destroy us already exists within us. And if it is given the proper environment to grow, then it will ultimately destroy us. And that might seem like a little bit of a stretch, because you have to first take into or agree with the assumption that you are being caused fear, and fear or darkness is being deposited within you in addition to this literal egg. But I just think that it's something that's worth taking note of, because when you're interpreting stories, ultimately the more things that you can find meaning in, the more you're going to be attached to that particular story. And we're going to talk about one more franchise that a lot of you probably aren't as familiar with. It's a comic book series, but that will be right after this last commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. So normally on the podcast, I like to kind of end with a suggestion for something that it is that you should get into in the sci-fi realm. But I am going to mix that in today with the subject matter that we're talking about. So the thing that I'm both recommending and that we're going to talk a little bit about is a graphic novel / comic book called Saga. Saga is... They call it an epic space opera fantasy comic book series. It's written by Brian K. Vaughan and illustrated by Fiona Staples. Published by Image Comics. They have like The Walking Dead, and Chew is another popular franchise that they have. A lot of people will compare it to like a intergalactic Romeo and Juliet. I just feel that that's woefully inaccurate for what it is that this is about. So the premise of Saga, or at least the basic premise so that you can kind of understand the universe that we're existing in, is that the largest planet in the universe, called Landfall, is at war with the population of its only moon, Wreath. The people of Landfall are born with wings and are capable of at least some form of sustained flight. Well, most of them are. And the people of Wreath are born with horns and are capable of using magic. And the war is was so bloody and awful that eventually they had to start taking that war away from home soil. So they stopped fighting amongst themselves within actual proximity of the planet and the moon, and they took that war elsewhere in the galaxy. So they basically brought people into alliance with them and ended up pitting most of the universe against each other. So you have all of these allies and enemies on both sides that are forced to side with either the Moonies, which is the Wreaths, or which are the Wreaths, I apologize, or the Wings, or the Horns or the Wings. There's a lot of kind of like slang terms that are thrown around in the universe. And the main characters are Marco and Elena, or Alana, I'm not totally sure. But they are from the two opposing forces. So Marco is the male lead, and he is from Wreath, and Alana, or Elena, is from Landfall. She's the female lead. Together they conceive a child, which wasn't thought to be possible, according to propaganda and science and everything that the opposing sides know about each other. And I think this is where we get the Romeo and Juliet comparison that a lot of people are familiar with, because it is kind of like two star-crossed lovers. But I just feel that it doesn't really capture the Quentin Tarantino-like violence and hyper realism that's in this particular series. I would liken it to kind of like a gruesome anime, I guess, would be the best way to phrase it. I don't really know exactly. It's not like anything else that you've read before, in my opinion. It uses all of the same storytelling faculties that we're familiar with. It just does it in a very interesting way. And one specific thing that I wanted to talk about from this publication, this series, is a character, actually. One of the characters that's introduced is the Will. And the Will is essentially a bounty hunter would be the easiest way to phrase it. Kind of a mercenary. And the mercenaries exist in this gray area between the two forces of Landfall and Wreath. And the Will, that's the name that he goes by as a bounty hunter. And the reason that I think that that name is so interesting is because it is symbolic of the will of the universe. So the story uses him as a foil to portray fate in a way, because it's never really clear what it is that the Will is so good at or why he is such a good bounty hunter. He has a unique weapon which is very useful, and he has an equally useful and interesting sidekick. And it's kind of ambiguously implied. That's a double negative. It's implied that he has some sort of super strength or something along those lines, because almost every situation that he gets into, he is able to get out of using pretty much exclusively his own strength. Now, what makes this interesting and what makes him so symbolic as a storytelling mechanism is that because it is seemingly impossible to stop him, he is similar to fate or the will of the writer, which is part of the reason why I think this is so interesting. The saga as a series often plays with the idea of the fourth wall. I mean, they specifically mention the hero's journey in a couple of their issues. They will pretty much straightforwardly address the reader without doing so by incorporating that into the story, kind of in like a Deadpool way, but it's not as tongue-in-cheek. And they do things in a couple of the comic book issues that are just such a radical departure from what you would normally get in a comic book series, that I really think that there's a lot more to the Will's name than it just being a cool name. Another reason that I would think that the Will's name has symbolic significance is because it kind of seems to lack motivation and direction. The motivation that we get for the Will as a character at first isn't necessarily the motivation that will end up pushing him forward later on. And his motivation at first doesn't seem to line up with our first impression of him as a character, or line up with his actions as we move forward through the story, which is part of why I think the Will is representative of the will of the writer, because it's really hard for us to decipher what the point of a lot of the things that a writer does is or are, what the point of the writer is in the things that they do. So the Will exists as this simultaneously purposeful but aimless and ultimately unstoppable force, which is at its core pretty much what fate is. The universe doesn't seem to be fair, and this is especially true in Saga. The universe doesn't seem to be fair to the people that deserve fairness. It seems to bless those who don't deserve to be blessed, and it seems to harm or take from those who had nothing to begin with, all while those above them prosper. So I think that the use of the will as a character and the will as a name is something that really adds an interesting element to this story. And it's part of the reason why, if you ask a lot of Saga fans, the will is one of their favorite characters. And he is rapidly turning into my favorite character to hate. But I'll let you read the series. There are 9 volumes, which equates to 54 chapters, I believe is what they're calling them, or 54 comic books. I personally like to purchase them in the volumes. They usually run somewhere between like $10 and $20 a piece, and they include 5 to 6 chapters per volume. So I highly recommend running to your LGS, that's local game store, or LCS, local comic store, either way, and picking up a copy. They're currently on a year-long hiatus. I just finished Volume 9, so I am all caught up with where they're at, and I can honestly say that it is definitely a really good either entry point into or way to renew your love of comics. However, viewer discretion advised, definitely adult content. If it was a movie, it would be rated R for sure. So that about covers it for me this week. So what do you guys think? Is there any more intentionality to this symbolism stuff than I want to give authors credit for? How important is understanding symbolism to understanding and finding meaning in art? Things like that. So let me know your thoughts. Like, comment, subscribe, leave me a 5-star review. That would be super awesome. And I will see you guys next week. Thanks for listening.